Hi everyone, Dana Lewin here again, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips for Leaders of Volunteers. And it's May, which means that you might be in budget battles and making the classic argument that volunteers are not free. This takes investment, this takes resources, this takes intention to have your volunteer services really have a positive mission impact with your organization. And ideally, when you're having budget discussions, you should have data and a narrative or an emotional connection or personal stories of success, triumph among the community because of what your agency is doing. So usually when you're making the persuasive conversation or points to a board or leadership, yes, of course, you have to have numbers to back it up. And so today, talking about Tuesday tips for doing an organizational self-assessment, for prioritizing, and also making the case, which I'll link to a few other videos I've done about return on investment of volunteer services. I'll mention it briefly, but dive in deep with this Tuesday tip up there. You want to have everyone in the agency understand the value of your role and your work leading a department as a leader of volunteers with your organization and your in-house expertise, and that data that ideally is aligned with KPI, key performance indicators, or other measures of outcomes and mission impact success that your agency is using. So when you align volunteer roles and activities with KPI or other benchmark, milestones, goals, that automatically starts to weave strategic volunteer engagement into the foundation of your work, which it should be. Volunteers are absolutely essential to the organizations that utilize their time and talent in capacity building and mission impact. So capacity building gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of the go-to phrase the last few years in nonprofit management or volunteer engagement. But really it's about how effectively can your organization fulfill its mission? How efficiently? How well can it leverage relationships and resources to get the job done and really move that needle of change within the community, hopefully towards a positive change and not a negative impact. But you don't know what's going on until you measure it. What isn't counted doesn't count. So going beyond the number of volunteers you have and the hours that they serve, that's the floor. And I'll link to some great information in the description below from my colleague and friend, Dr. Sue Carter-Kale, who's done a ton of research in her career with blog posts and research studies around that. And I'll also link to the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement Research, which talks about bridging that gap of funding between conversations with funders and conversations with CEOs, executive directors, general managers, other organizational leaders. But when you're in a budget battle, here's how you make the case. So there's the return on investment of volunteer resourcing. So for every dollar that you spend on volunteer services, for your own salary, for supplies, for the van to drive people around outreach booths, whatever those expenses are, those are directly tied to mission impact. And those are also directly tied to other returns on investment and benefits, both financial and just in the community for your brand, that happen with a great volunteer program and with volunteers that are having a good experience and talking about your agency in a positive way. So when you tie key performance indicators for maybe strategic planning of the agency, whatever those strategic pillars or goals or objectives or outcomes, desired outcomes are, when you tie that directly to the work that volunteers are doing, that helps upper management kind of understand the piece on the chessboard that volunteers are playing for the overall success of the organization. So if you do an organizational mapping tool, an OMT, and I'll link to one of those below, if you're not sure where to start, or if you're just recently putting a volunteer services department together, I've built out a lot of these programs and departments over the years. Needs assessment, organizational mapping tool that can help you align what volunteer team members are doing that directly support the mission. It's also important to maybe take a look at volunteer activities or programs or staff activities or programs that aren't having the desired impact on the mission, aren't having a positive outcome with the community, and where that balance is of an initiative launching or getting rolling and kind of needing time to evolve and grow and develop. So maybe a couple of years if you're doing something really new as an agency, might be at least a year until you see result. And so for budget planning, having to plan, usually several months ahead of time, and May being kind of when you're having the final battles or decision making, having as much data as possible, bringing the information beyond hours and number of people to what's really happening. If it's a literacy program, how many people did learn to read, and how this quarter or this past year, because of what volunteers are doing, working in conservation a lot in my career, we could measure things like number of acres of wetlands restored, things like that tie directly to the mission. That helps internally create the budget battle a little bit easier and kind of set the conditions for getting the resourcing and funding that you want. Another thing I've mentioned in a couple other videos, but I want to summarize here, is track your own team or your personal productivity. What was your work-a-lanch load before, in the before times? How has your workload been in the past few years of the pandemic? And how does that look a few years into the COVID-19 situation? And what can you do for capacity building? Again, sustainability and effectiveness of mission is what we're talking about with capacity building, that you can grow to meet the needs in delivering the services that is the mission of your agency. What does that look like in a sustainable way in the next year or 2 years or 3 years? That has to be funded. So volunteers are not free, and it's very easy. This has happened to me in agencies that I've worked for as my full-time job, where because they think that volunteers are free, upper management or the board or other kind of budget decision makers think, well, volunteers don't cost anything. We only have one full-time volunteer coordinator, or we have a part-time volunteer coordinator, and yeah, they're just over there doing their thing. No, it's really your job to educate and kind of manage up and make it very, very clear the value of volunteer services directly tied to mission impact, and then use that organizational mapping and other kind of assessment tools that I'll link to in the description to, and return on investment of volunteers. There's an easy calculator that I love that's put out by Sterling Volunteers. I'll link to that again below. But use all of these data points to really make the case so that you get the help you need on your team if you need to hire more people to help take stuff off your plate, and just that volunteers have the resources to comfortably do their task and go through their learning journey, whether that's computers, laptops, paying for VPN for volunteers to safely work remotely and get into your servers off-site, whatever that looks like, reimbursing for parking, reimbursing for uniform costs. When you think about anything that is an expense to the agency around resourcing and supporting volunteers, and also making it easier and more accessible and equitable for people to volunteer with your agency with fewer barriers or costs or out-of-pocket expenses for them. So all of those things can be folded into your budget. You can successfully make the case. And really, there's a scarcity mindset that happens in the nonprofit industry that doesn't have to be there. Budgets are about priorities. And so if you have the data and the information for why volunteer services should be a very high priority, then that's going to help make your case as well. Work closely with your development department or fundraising or other operational departments, and get an idea of what their operating budgets are for overhead, and that can also help you get the data to ask for specific grants. So again, the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement talks about research around having those conversations with organizational leaders and funders to directly give more money to volunteer services and volunteer engagement as capacity building and just for overall mission impact and success. So I hope you enjoy these weekly Tuesday tips. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, subscribe, hit the little alert bell to know when I have a new video up just about every Tuesday, and upcoming priceless advice interviews as well. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.